Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a wrap-up specifically for some new releases. I know we often love the anticipated releases videos that people do. I know I love those videos, but then we often don't see a lot of follow-up because it's hard to read everything we want to read on top of all of the new releases. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more information about books that have come out recently. The three books that I'm going to be discussing would be Winter's Orbit, All the Tides of Fate, and Wings of Ebony, all of which kind of had a purpley pink vibe, so I tried to match with the eyeshadow and the glasses that I'm wearing. And speaking of those, today's video is sponsored by GlassesUSA, and I am doing another giveaway. This time the giveaway is going to be over on Instagram, so I have this picture over here up, and then you can just comment on that picture as well as follow GlassesUSA.com, follow their Instagram page. That's all you have to do to enter, so I'll have that linked down below. But if you don't know what GlassesUSA.com is, it's an online glasses retailer where they take the middleman out of the equation, which allows for you to get glasses at a more affordable price. They have all sorts of different shapes and sizes of glasses, different styles. I have quite a few different pairs from them, so it's always a little bit of a decision to figure out which pair I want to wear for the day. Like I said, this particular pair has a little bit of a pinkish shade to them, and it's a little bit muted, so even though the shape, the rectangular shape, is very prominent and very obvious and a little bit more on the bold side, I think that the color kind of brings it down, so it's not too bold. We also have this particular pair. This is one of my classic favorite pairs. It's the gold rimmed Ray-Bans. I love a good circular pair of glasses. I just think that they're classic and they're cute. And this, to me, I can wear something very casual, but because there's a little bit of gold and it's got this on the side where the legs are, I just think it makes it a little bit fancy. I also love this clear pair. I'm a huge fan of clear frames. I think they look so cool. I want way more pairs of glasses with clear frames. They go with everything. I think they sort of have a very modern look to them, but because they're clear, they also are just very wearable. You can wear them with anything. When I was first trying GlassesUSA before I ever worked with them, I was always really nervous that the glasses were not going to look the way they looked online, but they do have an online try-on where you can upload a picture of yourself and virtually try the glasses on. Even then, I was a little hesitant, but I have always loved the way they come out. I think they look very similar to what they end up looking like in person, so I highly recommend them. If you are interested in any of these glasses, I'll have links to them directly, as well as just GlassesUSA.com's website. And if you are interested in winning a free pair, like I said, I'll have the details down below for following on Instagram. Jumping into the books, I'm going to start with Winter's Orbit, which is an adult science fiction story. If you are into really hard sci-fi, I don't think that this is the science fiction story for you, but if you are somebody who likes sci-fi light, or if you're somebody who really likes contemporary stories, but you want to be getting into fantasy and sci-fi a little bit more, then I think this one would be perfect. We follow two main characters in this book. We kind of swap back and forth between their point of views, and they are forced to marry one another to fulfill the peace within the political realm of their different societies. And our main characters are very, very different in their personalities. One of them is very sweet, kind of happy-go-lucky. Honestly, in some ways reminded me of Dandelion from The Witcher, because they find themselves getting into a lot of trouble, but they're not malicious at all. They're just kind of bumbling around and getting into trouble on accident sometimes, but they're definitely a people person. They get along basically with everybody except for their superiors, because their superiors are always like, oh my gosh, can you please just focus? That's kind of the vibe of the character Kiem. And then our other main character, he is somebody who I don't know how much I want to say, because while certain aspects of his personality were very obvious to me, I don't know that they will be obvious to everyone, and I don't want to spoil it, but they are very, very, very reserved, and they are somebody who's trying very hard to fulfill the role that they have been given, and so they end up constantly trying to not bother anybody or get on anyone's nerves. They're just always trying to do what they're asked to do. And these two individuals are forced to marry one another to fulfill this treaty, essentially, and they are not really sure because they were so thrown into this last minute. They don't really know much about each other. And on top of all of this, the other character, Jinan is his name. He is somebody who recently lost his spouse. And so Kiem, the other main character, is thinking, oh my gosh, this poor guy, his spouse was just killed, like he just died, and suddenly this poor guy is being forced to marry me. Oh my god. And he's trying so hard to be super understanding, and it's really hard for them to read each other's signals. The story really gets moving when they find out that perhaps Jainen's former spouse who died may not have died by some kind of an accident, and perhaps it was actually murder. So there's a little bit of a murder mystery element to it. There's a little bit of politics to it, but really it's more of kind of a love story and a character examination, and examination of trauma. I thought the way the author explored this trauma was really well done. I thought they put a lot of care into it, and ultimately I really liked the characters, and I thought that the love story aspect was quite sweet and sort of wholesome, even though it's a little bit of a murder mystery type of story. But like I said, if you're not really into soft sci-fi, light sci-fi, then I don't think that you're going to really find yourself gravitating toward this one. But if you do think it sounds interesting, I would recommend it. The writing style, I think the author did a good job, even though it is third person for both point of views. When you are with the different characters, the narration style changes a little bit to fit them, and I thought that they did that really well. I found myself chuckling quite a few times with the character Kiem. I will say, because it is sci-fi, I think that the author utilized these sci-fi elements really well as far as the way the society looks. So the idea of two men being married to each other to fulfill this alliance was not anything anybody thought was crazy. They have characters who, when it comes to how they identify, and if you should call them she or he, it has to do with how they dress and certain things that they are wearing. So a person can meet someone and they can check those things, and then that establishes how they're going to refer to them. And it's just something that, if it's science fiction, you can imagine that the world is going to be different from our own. And I think that the author did a good job of having something be normalized in a place where it wasn't necessary for it to not be normal, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like how we talk about how we can imagine worlds with really complex magic systems and dragons and mythological creatures, but we can't possibly imagine that gay people can exist and it's no big deal. And in this book, gay people exist and it's no big deal. And I think that, we don't see that very often in adult science fiction fantasy. And I thought the way that the author utilized that element of sci-fi was very different from some other sci-fi I've seen. Next up, we have Wings of Ebony. This is a YA it's almost like urban fantasy, because a lot of the story actually takes place in the United States, in Houston, and then there is a magical place and some magical elements that are tied into it. I almost want to consider it magical realism, because while it is fantasy and there are fantastical elements, they really don't come into play as much as I was expecting. So this story follows a character who, her mother died, and her father, who she didn't really know, suddenly kind of takes her to this magical place and then is raising her there. And then she goes back a year later to the US to try to see her half-sister, and then things go wrong, and the magic that she's starting to get to know through this other place is showing up, and things start to go wrong. I found it strange a little bit that the fantastical elements, I think, were clearly alluding to heavy topics, except for it was kind of interesting to do that when you have real world things that are not alluding to, they are just straight up saying, here's some issues we face. And I thought that the fantastical elements, not that, of course, fantasy can't explore these deeper things, like I was just talking about with Winter's Orbit, with the sci-fi book where they normalized people identifying differently and their sexuality, things like that. In this, it just was a strange decision to have one aspect be fantastical and then be touching on heavier things, while also having a pretty big majority of the book actually taking place in our own world, not magic related. And I couldn't quite pin down it, not that I needed to, but I think what I'm trying to say is I sort of wish that the author had just written a story, I hate to say, but without the fantasy elements to it. I felt similarly about the book Girls of Paper and Fire, which touched on sexual assault. And I think the author, in my opinion, took a lot of care with that aspect of that book, and it's such a focus of that book that the fantasy elements, when they were brought in, I felt like there wasn't really a lot of development for the fantasy parts. And then so it kind of just felt like an interruption. And in this book, I think I felt similarly about that aspect. I think that the fantasy elements, I don't know how much I felt they enhanced the story, because whenever we would be in the fantasy setting, this other place, I felt like I knew very little about this place. I didn't feel like I knew a whole lot about its magic. I didn't feel like I knew a whole lot about its technology or the way that the society functions. I would get little bits and pieces here and there, but not a lot where it ever felt extremely fleshed out. And so when we would get back to Houston, which is the area that it's taking place in the US, whenever we would be there, which was a lot of the book, then I just felt like the other stuff was an interruption. It ended up making it so that the focus was a little bit unclear as far as the plot goes, because there would be things going on in the fantasy place, and then really important stuff would be going on over here, and our character would jump over here, and then something would happen in the fantasy place, but then I didn't feel like I knew enough about the fantasy place to really care about what was going on, but then I'd care about her sister who was back here, and so she'd come back here, and it just ended up feeling like a lot in one book. I think I would have liked if that year that the character was in this fantasy place, if we actually could have had an entire book in that place, and then the real world comes calling back, and then we see our character have to go back to the US, and maybe there's some really hard decisions to be made about where her loyalties lie, if you will, if she can have herself be tied to these two different places, how her time is divided. I think I would have really, really, really liked that. I actually really want this author to write some kind of vigilante story, because there were parts of the book that reminded me of the Marvel Netflix shows like Daredevil and Luke Cage, where it's very gritty, and you can have magic put into it, but it's a little bit more centered on our own world. I actually really like stories like that, and I think that if this author ever wanted to write a story like that, I think she could do a really good job. But for me, the difficulties in being able to put both of these different locations as settings within this book, it just made me feel like I was pulled in maybe a little too many different directions. Last up, we have All the Tides of Fate, which is the sequel to All the Stars and Teeth. This is a kind of sea island setting. We follow a character who's supposed to take the throne, and her family are the rulers of these different islands, and within these different islands you use different magic. And I always describe this story, at least the first one when I read it, as being very vivid and vibrant. And by that I mean that the descriptions are always really interesting. I'm somebody who often gets a little bogged down if you have too much description on the fantasy things. And this one, I never felt that way. I was always really captivated by the descriptions, and I think that held true for this sequel. I do think, though, that this is the kind of story, this is a duology, so it's done after this one, that you probably want to just pick up the first one and then go right into the second one. And because I read them both around the time that they came out, I definitely wish I had reread the first one, because it does kind of just go right in. Time-wise, there's a little bit of a skip between books 1 and 2, but nothing crazy. And it is a formal break. I don't think it was a bad decision, like it should have been a standalone or something. It's just that the things from the first book that were important to this one, I think, are the things that you're going to want to have it fresh in your head, and it wasn't as fresh in my head. So I still enjoyed it, though. I definitely think that this is a very cozy, fun, adventurous story, but I don't know if it's exceptionally deep. I don't think it's the most original thing I've ever read, but it was fun. It's a good time. Like I said, the descriptions are really cool, really interesting. I definitely think the author thinks about what makes every individual island different from the other, and that again plays into the descriptions being really fun. I enjoyed our main character. She's a little uptight, she's a little much, but she ultimately just wants to go on an adventure. And the ending actually is what really sold the book for me, because a lot of the book was just, you know, a fun adventure story, which I was down for. But the end was like kind of surprisingly emotional, and I wasn't really expecting that. There are, of course, so many other books that have come out recently that I would love to cover, and if I can, I will try to cover them either at the end of the first quarter of the year or the end of the first 6 months of the year if I haven't gotten to them yet, because there are a lot that I'm still very intrigued by. But that's a little bit of information on those. So I'll have those linked down below if they do sound good to you. Also, I will have GlassesUSA.com linked and all the details for the giveaway. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all later. Bye.